Thanks very much, Sean, and thanks to Eva for inviting me to talk today. Any of you who watched or participated in the panel on Monday night will have had a hint of what I'm going to say, because I used that provocation opportunity to say a few words about what I'm going to cover in my talk now. So one or two slides may be familiar. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a moment while I get that sorted. Okay, so the subject of my talk is AI, IA, and art. To spell that out a bit, artificial intelligence or intelligence augmentation for art. This is a subject that has been a great concern of mine forever, more or less. And one slide that I showed on Monday was this one. In fact, what I didn't mention was that at the Computer Graphics 70 conference and exhibition, the Computer Art Society ran a part of the exhibition and a stream of papers in the conference. And a number of us, other names you'll know very well, like Frida Naka and Manfred Moore, for example, spoke in that stream, as did I with the late Stroud Cornock. Stroud also has contributed greatly to the Computer Art Society over the years. So that was an interesting event in 1970, Computer Art Society event. And the point is that Stroud and I gave this paper with the title, you only really have to read the title, "The creative process for the artist is amplified or superseded by the computer." So a question, will AI, this was a question in 1970, will AI lead to the artist or the creative practitioner being amplified in their creativity or superseded and got rid of? And so you can guess that the answer from artists was amplified rather than superseded, but I'll say more about that as we proceed. We actually made an interactive piece, Stroud and I, to show in that exhibition, which used a kind of ELIZA type dialogue. So a little tiny bit of artificial intelligence, you might say, as part of it. I'm not going to tell you all about it in detail, except to say that the input device and the output device, main one, was a teletype. So that was a start, and there's a theme there that is throughout the talk that I'm about to give you. But I built it around a whole series of meetings that were held on this Great Barrier Reef Island over the years. Just 18 months ago, we had our 30th anniversary get-together where we compared notes on what had happened over that 30 years on this island, where we, of course, sat on the beach, but also discussed important issues. And these are the themes of the papers that I presented at that workshop, at that series of workshops on Heron Island over the years. And you can see that they all are around the same topic. First of all, AI support for human creativity, how it was helping us be more creative. Then in '93, emergence, the emergence of new understandings or new perceptions from things we see that we didn't know were there in the first place. Strategic knowledge, meta-knowledge, knowledge about knowledge. And then interacting with AI to generate new ideas, a kind of extension of the 1809 paper. Moving on to collaborative creativity, and the emphasis then on human experience and engagement. So not on what the machine enjoyed, did the robot like it, but what did the human experience? And I mean by here, in this sense, both the human audience and the creative person, the artist. So summing up in 2019, all about augmenting creativity. And that's the subject of my talk, which I'll illustrate through my own work. So it's prejudice to my own work, but that's the easiest way for me to talk about it. So in 1989, the challenge that I put forward was enhancing creativity by humans interacting with AI. Enhancing human creativity by interacting with knowledge in AI systems. And this is a quote from the paper that I presented there. Knowledge-based systems have introduced a new mechanism for the support of creativity, I said. Okay. And the key point being that in interacting with knowledge in a system, changing it, modifying it, in effect, writing AI systems, you might say, or modifying them, that process we discovered was a significant trigger for creative thought. This had come about not just by postulating, not by sitting in an armchair and thinking, but by observing people doing this kind of thing in the lab. We were working in what was a popular thing in those days called expert systems, where people would externalize their knowledge, or people would try to get knowledge out of experts and build them into systems. And in doing that kind of work, which we were doing for reasons that needn't bother us today, we observed that the knowledge was being advanced quite dramatically, and that the experts were being creative about their knowledge in going through this process. And that seemed to us to be much more important than the building of expert systems. I was using it to make artwork, sometimes very simple, but underneath them with relatively complex code. This is a bit of Prolog. Prolog was a famous artificial intelligence language popular at that time. And of course, we moved on and came to understand, and this was what I wrote in 1999, that constructive, creative, and engaging interactive behaviors was really important and valuable. One of the things that computers can do for art is provide a medium where interaction is much easier to implement and to play with and to mold. And at the same time, artificial intelligence is actually defined by the way that we interact with it. It's a behavioral thing. We identify the intelligence of an artificial system, if we wish to call it intelligent, by its behavior. So I was then making artworks using pattern recognition and other forms of artificial intelligence, reacting to movement, people waving at the artwork, to sound, so doing performances with the musicians, where the visual work was being influenced by the musician, and there was a dialogue going on between them, and so on. So these issues were really valuable way of moving forward, and also a way of starting to think about the importance of the human experience in terms of these, we might say, ambient interaction methods, not using headsets and whatnot, but just by moving or talking or playing an instrument or whatever. So I started to think about AI and IA and art at that time and what it meant. What did AI, what did IA mean for art? I was already working in that field. I ran a journal called Knowledge-Based Systems, which is still going these days. And we looked at the technology, but the technology wasn't quite as interesting as what could we do with it? And what I wanted to do with it was enhance creativity. Enhance creativity of the artist, of course, but also the audience, perhaps better called the participants. Okay. This was a main goal in many people's minds in making interactive art. And we seem to have a great opportunity here. And what does the AI systems, what do the AI systems offer? Well, a number of things, all different, like surprises. So some people find their creativity is stimulated by a surprise. And this is quite common in art. People have used chance and in the early days of computing, pseudo-random numbers and so on, to throw up things that they wouldn't otherwise have thought of in the hopes that one or other of these things will be interesting. So surprises is one thing that's interesting. Managing complexity is another important thing, that the AI makes it easier for us to actually get a handle on the complexity, particularly available to us in building these interactive systems. Pattern recognition, I've already mentioned, makes it easier to build interactive systems because we can see something in the world out there and recognize what it is inside the computer. And then it offers a route towards learning and evolution and change. And it's this area that seems to me to be the most important of all of these. In a way, the surprises are okay, but that's not a big deal. And maybe there's a lot I have to go around that in terms of our understanding of art and what we're trying to do and so on to make it really useful. Managing complexity is certainly very interesting. Pattern recognition is kind of straightforward in a way. I mean, it's a complex subject, but it's straightforward in a way of how to use it. But learning and evolution, this offers many opportunities for us to move art on, and I'll say something about that. So the challenge, which by 2005 I was really pushing forward on, was evolving generative behavior in response to experience. That's to say, building art systems that evolved using their generative behavior in response to experience, in other words, in response to the data that came in from cameras, microphones, etc. Could be data from across the internet about the weather or whatever. But the point being that the behavior of these art systems can be changed forever, so that the experience that the work has today means that next week, next year, it's a different work to what it would have been otherwise. So this is the interesting challenge. And after all, that kind of models what we do. So it's a sort of metaphor of human life. So it's a pretty important concept and very different to a sort of action response model of interaction, which is somewhat mechanical in always getting the same answer, if you like. So interaction and influence. I introduced this word influence, which is the one I use all the time now, to indicate that I'm not just talking about interaction, do something happens back, but there's an influence on the future life of the system. And of course, in reverse, a future life on us. So in terms of influence, I'm talking about data from the world changing the internal states, the rules, the pattern recognition algorithms, and so on within the system. So that the behavior of the art system evolves over time. The art system itself evolves and is ever changing. So I would argue that the psychological models of interaction that are important for us are not action response ones, which are really pretty simplistic and not very helpful psychologically either, but systems theory ones that include this changing of modes, changing of future behaviors, if you like, changing the rules of the game. So interactions that affect the future and that may have no observable response at this time. That's a challenge in itself for the art. And in this way, the interactive experience in this influence model is a never-ending process of development. But more importantly, it's a mutual influence between the participant and the art system. Both are being changed by one another, augmenting the creativity, particularly in this case of the participants. So back in those days, I started making these works called Shaping Form, where there are abstract works that change in time, but there are cameras. You can see one at the top right there, looking down over that particular piece. That in the case of these examples that you see here, the cameras are feeding data into computers, which are analyzing the amount of movement in front of the piece, very simple in a way, but leading to complex behavioral changes, color changes. When a piece like this has been in an exhibition for a month or two, it's different. It's using different colors and different behaviors to the beginning of the day. Then moving into the street, so making these works for the public place. That first one, that slide was in Sydney, this is in Melbourne. Which leads to another notion that I find very interesting and goes back to some work I did around about the time of that paper I mentioned before, work I did in 1971. This is a different challenge really, but that moving of those shaping forms into the street led to it. Cooperative creativity, more than one person working together through the artwork, through the art system, in a distributive way, influencing one another, influencing the art system, cooperating on developing what the artwork is. Back in 1971, I had to build the network, and the system was all in one room. Today, that can be across the world. In the case of these two images here, between Berlin and Sydney, for example. So these works, and there's a whole series of works, including some I've done collaboratively with our good chair today, Sean Clark, called Cities Tango. This is the two images, one in Sydney and one in Belfast, where in each case, the work is interactive with the local people, but connected across the internet is interacting with the two components. So that what happens in Sydney is influencing what people see in Belfast and vice versa. You can guess that the left-hand image is the work as it sits in Sydney, in an art gallery there, and the right-hand one is an image as it sits in Belfast, actually in the ICEA exhibition of that year. And these then become installations. They can be installations in galleries, can be installations in public spaces. But all of them have these various qualities that I want to stress. And these are ones I stressed on Monday. Say a little bit more about it now. That the answer that I have is that AI is really important for enhancing human creativity, both the creativity of the artist, but also to enable the artist to offer a more creative experience to the audience, in this case, really the participants in those works. It's all concerned with process, with the process of developing the AI, the process of operating the AI in various ways that I've described in other places I won't go into now. But essentially, the really interesting work that's coming out of here is in its essence interactive. And so I concentrate on these three words: art, about action, human action, art system action, groups of humans acting together, communicating, you might say, across the internet, across space, across nations, across cultures, and the responses to those actions. Action and response, yes, but not action and response in a direct way necessarily. Action and response in the context of influence, where the responses can build up and change over time, and the art system can develop and form a new self as a result of the actions and responses that it has gone through with its participants. So we have an ever-evolving object, the art system, driven by AI, but in itself not the creative element. And what has the artist done here? Well, the artist has created a framework, a system, using AI, yes, but really a system that is enabling people to experience their creative lives through this changing process. I've written about this in lots of places. There's a couple of recent books. The Art of Interaction. Here, I just make this point. I always like to make this point that the computing world can learn from the art world, and it's not just one-way traffic. And I really want to press that the computing world looks at creative people, creative artists, and learn from them. And the second book, the bigger one there on the image, with Margaret Bowden, you will know from cognitive science fame, on interactive art, on computer-based art, on generative art, both history and philosophy. And I have to give a plug for Francesca Franco's nice book about my own work, in which you can read more about what I've said today. And I will finish there in time, hopefully, for a question or two. Sure.
Thank you very much, Ernest. Extremely interesting. Yes, we do have some time for questions. So if anybody out there would like to chip in, feel free to do so.